If you have a thought, question, comment, Twitter is the best way to just kind of share that with everybody here and with me, and I read every comment on that hashtag, so I will definitely see it. So I want to say thank you very much in advance for the feedback. Of course, if you prefer the old-fashioned methods, you're welcome to come up. I'll stick around both during dinner and after if you want to ask a question or chat. I'll be here. Like I said, you'll have even more time to use me as your punching bag tomorrow. So those are the ground rules. Were they clear? Questions about that, everyone? All right, good. So here's why I'm here. We like to talk about the good part of entrepreneurship, but I'd like to start with the bad news. The bad news is that most startups fail, and I brought a demonstration. You may remember this graphic. I see we got a few people who remember this from the height of the Web 2.0 revolution, as we were going to change the world through the incredible wave of innovation unleashed through Web 2.0. A graphic designer made this kind of patchwork quilt of all the logos of that wave of innovation, and they recently updated it. I was really thrilled when I saw this. So this is what the quilt looks like now. The red X's, of course, represent the companies that are no longer with us. Interestingly, the green circles, I don't know if you can see this, represent the so-called successes, that is the ones where there was some kind of exit. And then the ones that are not marked are the companies that are still with us. Some of those are doing okay, and others are just in the land of the living dead. So when we say most startups fail, I think it's important that we remember, we're not talking about like a few fail, but the people who deal with startups professionally say something like 8 out of 10, I hear some VCs say basically 9 out of 10 startups fail. They're looking for the 1 out of 10 success. And I actually think as an industry, that's getting off really easy. Because that standard is just, did the investors who put money in get money out? But I don't think that's a good enough standard of success. I think we're really, we owe it to ourselves to hold ourselves to a higher standard. Because we invest some of our most precious human capital as a civilization in creating these new startups. We get the absolute smartest, most creative people we can possibly find. But we assemble them into teams where they work 24/7, give 120%, and really have the potential to revolutionize the world. Every startup has the chance to build an institution that will change the world. And I think it is basically a criminally negligent waste of human potential for so many of those companies to fail. And I came out to Boulder to talk to you tonight because I don't think it has to be that way. I think we can do better, and that's what I want to talk about. So the lean startup, before it's anything else, is a vision for an alternate reality, a possible future that we could inhabit as an entrepreneurship industry, where the practice of entrepreneurship is on a more rigorous footing, and the mortality rate of our efforts is, maybe slightly better, but I hope dramatically better than it is today. So that's my objective in being here, and I hope that's a topic that has at least some resonance for some of you. Let's start with the basics. First of all, what is a startup? There's a lot of misconceptions about this because our natural impulse, when we think about the word startup, we usually think about two guys in a garage, right? They're heroically seeing a vision of the future that nobody else sees, and of course, they got no money, so they're eating ramen, and they're living in their parents' basement. And of course, they're ridiculed because their idea is considered just absolutely ridiculous. But they persevere in the face of all odds, and if it was a movie about entrepreneurship, you'd see the cut scene. We'd cut straight to, they're on the cover of Time magazine. Everyone apologizes to them for treating them so badly before, and in fact, their idea has gone from being absolutely inconceivably ridiculous to being considered obvious, which is the highest compliment an idea could receive. And first of all, the apology never comes, so those who are wondering, I can tell you it doesn't happen. And actually, everything about that story is highly misleading. The reason it's important to start with that simple truth is that many of the myths of entrepreneurship that we actually run our companies with come out of those kinds of folk stories about what we think entrepreneurship looks like. And so if we're going to be more successful as an industry, I think it's important that we abandon some of those myths. And this is the place to start. So here's my definition of a startup: a human institution designed to create something new under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And it's that last qualifier, that extreme uncertainty, that's the most important one. Most businesses, most institutions do not deal with extreme uncertainty on a daily basis. Most human beings are not fond of dealing with extreme uncertainty and in fact are paralyzed in the face of it. One of the defining attributes of an entrepreneur is the ability to cope with the kind of chaos that this extreme uncertainty brings. But there's a very important liability that comes along with it, which is that most what we call best practices come out of some specific context. And when we transplant a practice into that soil of extreme uncertainty that really isn't well adapted for it. Like a plant, it withers and dies. And so one common cause of startup mortality is that we adopt best practices from a different context. And so that's one of the things we're going to talk about is what are the practices that actually help us cope with the uncertainty about who is going to want this product if we build it? And will anybody pay for it? Or is there any earthly reason why any person other than the people inside the bubble of our company want us to be doing this? I just want to borrow one other buzzword. This is product market fit. This is Mark Andreessen's term for that elusive quality that separates the successful startups from the unsuccessful startups. So if we think about why startups fail, if you compare the successful startups to the unsuccessful startups and you ask yourself, what's different? Is it, for example, one common belief is that the quality of the ideas of the founders of startups that were successful were better. They had better ideas at the beginning. And I can tell you, having been a founder and having met many, many, many founders, if you can get to the real story of what happened at the beginning of most companies, you will discover that the founders' initial ideas were laughably bad. Okay, they were not even remotely in accordance with reality. They had, at most, a kernel of truth, a little nugget of insight that then eventually the company grew around. And so the first question is, what does success even look like when that kernel grows? And we use this term product market fit, which means we finally found a version of the product that resonates with some set of people out there in the world that really addresses a core need that they have, that gets them excited about engaging as early adopters with that product. Mark divides companies into two phases, basically before product market fit and after. And I want to focus really on the part before product market fit, because once you're there, a lot of companies, when they kind of achieve that explosive growth that comes when you really have that resonance with your customer, you can actually make a lot of mistakes, and your company is very resilient against them. So it's harder to screw it up then. But before you've got product market fit, startups are extremely vulnerable and very fragile and very easy to crater. So product market fit is a very helpful concept. It's one of those things like pornography. You know it when you see it. It's actually not that helpful if you don't have it right now. So let's actually get into some of the details for, all right, we're not sure if we have product market fit, but how are we going to get there? And my aspiration for this talk and for the work we'll do tomorrow, for those who are interested in joining us, is to not just give you kind of the overall abstract methodology, but really dive into some very specific, what I think of as actionable ideas that you can implement right away in the companies that you come from. So how many people are currently entrepreneurs in the room right now in a startup? Okay, good. So in a mixed audience, you'll see there's some slides that have various disclaimers on them because, of course, I don't believe that startup, since that definition I gave is a little bit broad, I think you can find startups in enterprise, you can find them in government, you can find them in every sector and size of company. But I think in this audience, we can skip some of that. So let's start with the first concept. It's called the pivot. I mentioned that most startups begin with a really bad idea and then somehow find success. What's important about those companies, you think about PayPal, right? Starting off as like digital cyber cash for PDAs and then becoming the world's largest online payment provider for eBay. And you're kind of like, how did they get from here to there, right? They started making basic interpreters, but then they had the world's largest operating system monopoly. Flickr is one of my personal favorites because it started as an online game and then it was a photo sharing site. It's kind of like, okay, if you get to the real story, you can kind of unwind that thread of connection, but it's a little bit tenuous. And so the first key idea is what we call the pivot. When your idea doesn't work, you might be tempted to say, forget it, give up, this isn't working, we're not getting the traction we want, maybe, God forbid, we have investors already and they're getting a little tired, we're running out of money. We were building toasters, let's build a floor wax instead. And just kind of jump to something randomly new. But that strategy doesn't actually work very well because it causes you to abandon anything you might have learned during your first major iteration. And so the idea of a pivot is to change directions in a focused way that says, kind of keeps one foot grounded in what you were doing before and another foot in something new. And so if you actually chart the course of successful startups, this is the pattern you see over and over again. This kind of zigzag move where each time something changes, it's not everything. It's just a specific part of the company's business plan changes. And it might take many different pivots to get to any kind of significant product market fit, but that's what we're looking for. So actually, if you want to brainstorm, what I recommend is you actually take every element of your company's business. What customer segment are we trying to serve? What problem are we solving for them? What technology are we building? What features does that technology have? How do we distribute it to customers? Who are our channel partners? Every element of your business plan. A pivot is when you hold all of those things constant save one. So you have an enterprise product and you decide, let's try it with a consumer audience. Or we have a product that solves a specific pain point. For example, you have a product that, this is an example that's near and dear to my heart. You have a product that you think helps customers hang out with their friends online. And then you discover, oh no, actually it's for making new friends online. So same customer, same product, same technology, same everything, except now we're going to focus around a slightly different need. Those subtle changes actually have really big ramifications. And that's the idea of the pivot. The lean startup, the premise of why it can help you is very simple. If we can reduce the time between those major iterations, those pivots, then we can increase our odds of success. The lean startup is all about getting as many of these per dollar spent and per hour spent as you can, so that you don't end up in the fate of all unsuccessful companies, which is just they had at least one too few pivots. Right? They ran out of money before they could finally get their idea to product market fit. Does that make sense? If it doesn't make sense, we should pause and talk about it now, because nothing else I'm going to say is actually going to make any sense at all if we haven't gotten this concept clear. Okay, just checking. So let me tell you a little bit about my background and this kind of tell you about two of the companies that I've had the privilege to be involved with that have exhibited some of these patterns, both on the positive and the negative side, and maybe you'll see the relationship to what I was talking about before. Startup number one, I only ever euphemistically refer to as startup number one. Because like the leading generic brand or something, I don't. It's actually kind of unpleasant to talk about. This is not necessarily the most fun experience anyone could ever have. So startup number one, I actually found this photo. I came out to Silicon Valley to join startup number one. I was actually really excited. So imagine me. I was fresh out of college. I'd already had one failed startup, and I was like, all right, I want to go to Silicon Valley. I want to learn how the pros do it. So this mysterious company that was in stealth gets a hold of my resume, and I have a really challenging technical interview over the phone. And they fly me out to Silicon Valley and ask me to come to the office for a more serious interview. I still don't know what they do. Really, no clue. And this nondescript building in the middle of nowhere is where they asked me to show up. And inside the building is the following sign. I don't know if this is big enough that you can read it. It says, this is a huge foam core board. It says, we are building something that your friends will lust after and beg to beta test. It's not B2B e-commerce. See, this is during the bubble, and that was cool. B2B e-commerce was all the rage. We can't tell you what it is, but we can tell you who's on the team. In startups, it's all about the team. Okay, this basically had me at hello. Right? You walk in the door, you have no idea what you're doing, what's going on, and I was like, I don't care what this company does, but I want to be a part of it, because my idea at that time was if I could find just the absolute smartest group of people on the planet building a company, they'll be successful, and I want to be a part of that. And so here's what happened. I eventually did join this company, and I got to finally see the business plan, and it was actually a really exciting plan. The idea here was we were going to build a company with a compelling long-term vision. So this was not a built-to-flip kind of quick hit. We wanted to make a lasting contribution to the internet. We, of course, wanted to raise plenty of capital from the right, first-tier investors. And then, as you saw, we're going to hire the absolute best and the brightest. So we're going to take true experts in their field, and we're going to have them lead whole departments of people that are at their caliber or better. Somehow I got in, I'm not clear about that, but everybody else was really top-notch. You gotta believe me. This is one of the smartest, highest talent compilations of people I've ever seen. And in fact, jumping ahead a little bit, tons of really successful startup founders got their start in this company, but not the founders of this company, as we'll talk about in a second. We needed an experience management team, so we had a management team that had experience in big companies, small companies, startups, every domain, you name it. And then we were going to focus on quality. So the idea here, this is going to date this whole thing a little bit, but this company was aspiring to be the next AOL, back when that was still cool. And the idea was it would be naive to think that the next AOL would ship a product of low quality, because we wanted to reach mainstream customers. Worse than a low quality product, we were worried, well, we don't want to have some kind of ghetto niche product that only those loser early adopters are going to use. Now the next AOL is going to be built for true mainstream customers. So we're going to basically ship it when it's ready, when it's right, and when it is of a high enough quality that those mainstream customers are going to flock to it. Of course, we needed a world-class technology platform, patent pending, etc., to support that. And the most important thing was we need to build buzz for this company. Why? Not just to feed our egos, although let me tell you, it's really fun to be one of those stealth secret companies that people speculate about. No one knows what it's doing. The strategy was, we want to reach mainstream customers. So how do you reach mainstream customers? You need to appear during your huge launch in the media venues that they pay attention to. So New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN needs to all say, all the right bloggers and tech writers all need to say that your thing is the next big thing. That's how you'll reach mainstream customers. And in order to do that, you build your product in stealth. So we did that. We had a completely stealth product for almost 5 years while we built out this incredible technology platform for mainstream customers. So what happened? We did what I call achieving failure. I told you it was painful to think about because this company was a total failure. We spent about $40 million in, like I said, about 5 years of all of those incredibly talented people's company energy. The company actually became a defense contractor, which is a unique kind of purgatory for a consumer internet company to wind up in. I can't say that was the best feeling, but I call it achieving failure, and this is the key point. It's not. We did not fail, in my opinion, because we failed to execute that good plan I just showed you. On the contrary, I think we executed it really well. That is, we put together a really top-notch team. We built incredible technology, and let me tell you, we had the best launch you could possibly imagine. So all the right media outlets thought that, we were building the 3D internet. So they're like, the future of the internet is now 3D, and we had the attention of all the customers we wanted to get. So if that wasn't the problem, what was, you might ask? I think that this company was crippled by what I call shadow beliefs that destroyed all of that effort and energy. And I call them shadow beliefs because these were things that I believe every person in the company agreed with, believed in strongly, and yet were never, ever spoken out loud. Not once. In fact, if we had a copy, I wish I did, of the original business plan for this company, it was like 200 pages, I guarantee you none of these shadow beliefs will ever appear. And yet, if you look at the plan that we built and the plan that we executed, I think you'll find the shadow beliefs operating kind of at every level. And so there are 3 shadow beliefs that I want to talk to you about tonight. The first, that we know what customers want. And sometimes when I'm with entrepreneurs, this one seems obvious. Because why on earth would you go through all the pain and energy of starting a company unless you believe you know what customers want? Well, I should say, what customers will want. The thesis is when we finally build this amazing technology, there will be customers who want to use it at the end of the day. It's a power that I think entrepreneurs have more than any other group. It's called the reality distortion field. It's the ability to cause people in their immediate vicinity to believe as if they were true things which are not, in fact, literally true. Like, there are customers who want our product. The product doesn't exist, so there, by definition, cannot be customers who want it yet. They don't know what they want, right? Sound familiar to anybody? And there's something wrong with the reality distortion field, and I don't want you to get me wrong. Good entrepreneurs have it, bad entrepreneurs have it, and the only problem is that there's a third group of people who also have it. We call them crazy people. Right? Because, like, the way you create cults and all kinds of other nasty things is you have the charisma necessary to get people to believe things as if they were true that are not, strictly speaking, on a literal basis, true. So, in startup number 1, we had this in spades. We really believed we were out to change the world and we were going to be successful. And what I hope to talk about today, when we actually get into the techniques of a lean startup, is not that you should abandon the reality distortion field. That's impossible. But simply that every once in a while you consider stepping outside it and just taking a peek. Are we following a vision or are we following a delusion? And if it's a delusion, can we do something about it, or are we like literally about to fall off the cliff? The earlier you come to the realization that it's time to pivot, the less likely that you'll explode in the midst of it. Second shadow belief is that we can accurately predict the future. And this is one where if you said this out loud, you in fact would be considered crazy, but that's why we don't say it out loud. Yet we act in companies as if we had the ability to predict the future. I'll give you one example. Every company has a business plan, right? And in the back of the business plan, what is there? A spreadsheet. What does the spreadsheet say? If you're anything like me, the spreadsheet says that in year 5 you will have $100 million in revenue. Anyone have a spreadsheet that says $100 million in year 5? Lately, I've been talking to audiences where people will interrupt me and say, no, in year 3. So I guess we're getting more optimistic. Unfortunately, we have a lot more business plans that say we're going to have $100 million in revenue after 3 years than we have actual companies that ever achieve that milestone. But it's good to be optimistic. And like I said, nothing wrong with building a spreadsheet to model out what you think the business of your company is going to be. The problem comes when we treat the spreadsheet as if it's an accurate prediction of the future. So at startup number 1, every department, I remember this like it's clear as day, because in the business plan it said something like, at a certain period of time after the amazing launch, we will have 1 million simultaneous customers on this 3D internet product. So imagine you're, I don't know, the head of customer service. So you think about, all right, at a certain date, 1 million customers are all going to start rampaging towards this product. These are going to be mainstream customers, right? They don't tolerate bad customer service. And if I'm not staffed up to meet that demand, like, the company could fail. We could squander all this energy of all these hard-working people, and it could basically be my fault. So I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to be staffed up and ready. And I don't mean to pick on customer service. Of course, this same logic is happening across every department, not the least of which is engineering, who understands that we need to have a scalable architecture ready to deal with the load of 1 million people all showing up. So in this company, I think we were something like 200 employees before customers ever saw the product, because that same logic was multiplied across every department. And in engineering, we, built out this incredible patent-pending architecture, but those of you who are engineers in the room will know that if you want to actually have a scalable architecture, you need to have a pretty good model of customer behavior so that you can partition the load appropriately. And if that model is even slightly wrong, then your brilliant architecture that's supposed to support 1 million simultaneous users is still very expensive. It still takes you a long time to build, and it's still extremely rigid, but now it only supports 1,000 simultaneous customers. Right? Oops. And so we had that problem, I think as bad as you can have it. That's how you get up to $40 million in spending. But even companies that raise much lower amounts of capital, I see all the time acting as if what it says in the plan is literally true. Third problem, that advancing the plan is progress. So inside the reality distortion field, you ask yourself, what are entrepreneurs uniquely good at? Why do they generate this reality distortion field? What's its purpose? And my experience, and I'll speak as a founder, and also having worked with many founders now, that entrepreneurs are uniquely gifted at keeping people busy. Okay, that's what we're really good at. You talk to your average founder, they spend all day long selling. Anyone who will listen to them, right? They will sell their employees to make sure everyone's given 120%. Of course, we've got to sell our investors so that they believe that their investment was really wise and they shouldn't pull the plug. And of course, we're selling to potential partners, potential customers, journalists, PR agents, your mom, anyone who will listen. Founders are selling. As a result, you often see this phenomenon where a company that explodes and goes out of business, if you talk to them on the day before and you ask them how it's going, everything's fine, everything's great, we're 100%, everything's awesome, and it's like going. Startups never gradually die. They hit the wall full speed and explode. And you gotta ask yourself, why is that? Okay, really, 1 day away from going bankrupt, you really didn't have a heads up that something wasn't quite right, and of course they did. But every entrepreneur's heard those stories about the company that was just about to fail, and they pulled it out of the tailspin just at the last minute. And so we are eternally optimistic, and we want to make sure everyone in the reality distortion field is also optimistic, else it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's certainly no good. So when we're in conditions of extreme uncertainty, and we're being extremely optimistic, we tend to revert back to the things that are not as scary, and the things that we understand and can control. And so that basically means we judge our success by, did we meet the plan? Right? So that we have certain product milestones maybe. Most companies I see now are driven by product milestones. So when we hit a milestone, we celebrate. That means we made progress. That's basically just judging whether you expended energy. The founders that I've gotten to work with, and like I said, I'll fess up to this as a former founder myself, when they go to sleep at night, and they ask themselves, what did I accomplish today? They basically, the ones who are being honest will tell you, all right, I know that I kept everybody busy. I know that I spent money today. I know that I expended energy. But ask them this question, did you make any progress today? And I think most honest entrepreneurs, especially those who have been around the block a few times, will give you the only honest answer they have, which is, I don't know. And think about that. We expend energy without knowing whether we're making progress. And I think the challenge, and one thing we'll talk about, is because we don't really have an agreed-upon metric or methodology for determining what constitutes progress. If we're in a business where we might build something successfully that nobody wants, as we did in startup number 1, then it makes it actually very difficult to know if building something constitutes progress. I think actually it doesn't. Nor do I think that generating revenue constitutes progress or any other tangible artifact. We'll get to what I do think is progress in a second. But let me just go back to the good plan. I don't want to belabor this point, but I sometimes get asked in audiences of entrepreneurs, isn't it kind of obvious? Like, nobody really believes our shadow beliefs. Like, that's a funny story, haha, you guys were obviously crazy at startup number 1, so that's great. But we don't believe that in my company. And listen, if you're the company that doesn't believe the shadow beliefs, like, more power to you. All I would ask is that you compare your plan to this plan. And ask yourself, both for this plan and for that plan, if I really didn't believe any of those 3 shadow beliefs, would I still think that the plan was good? And just hold that question for a second. Because I actually got the chance to start over again. Several of us who were refugees from startup number 1 got to create startup number 2, and I can actually talk about startup number 2. It's called InView. I brought some pictures. InView is a 3D avatar-based social network and instant messaging product. You basically interact, like I said, you meet new people online with your 3D avatar. It's all user-generated content, so you can actually use micropayments to buy clothes and furniture and other items for your avatar, and those items are all created by third parties. So any budding clothing designers in the audience want to try your hand at making a living, creating fashion designs or furniture, InView is for you. Obviously, I don't have any immediate takers, which I guess is no surprise, given our demographics. I was actually just doing a version of this talk in Japan, and so I compiled this set of screenshots. InView is now a worldwide, internationally successful phenomenon in many countries, and I'm very proud of it. But that's actually not what I want to talk to you about tonight. I want to go back in time, before InView was successful, and I want to talk about what we were doing in 2004 when we started the company. Because we had the chance to create a new plan, and I think it was the magnitude of our humiliation in startup number 1 that gave us the psychological freedom to say, you know what, for God's sakes, this time, let's at least make new mistakes. Right? We had done things that people told us were the right things to do, and we got lauded for our amazing good plan and good judgment while we cratered this giant company into the ground. And that was embarrassing. We said, well, if we're going to be embarrassed again, let's at least have it be for doing something that we understand why you would want to do this. So we had the chance to kind of re-examine our assumptions about how startups should be built and try something that we thought was at least different in some interesting ways. So let me walk through some of the elements of this new plan. First thing, we shipped this product in 6 months. So I mean literally 180 days from when we incorporated this company to when we were in full open public beta. We were not hiding behind codes or invite, none of that stuff. Full open public beta, we had a version of this product. And I can always tell when there's engineers in the audience because I can see them start to do the time, quality, money math in their head. They're like, wait a minute, you said that it was a fixed amount of time, 180 days, and let me count up the scope. We're doing some scope budgeting real quick. We've got 3D avatars and the rendering engine, and we've got user-generated content, social network, and blogs, and start to work out all the features and say, wait a minute, you couldn't have built all those features in that amount of time. Something obviously had to give. And I want to be really forthright about this. What gave was quality. This was an incredibly crappy product. I'm not going to mince words about this. This is a product that would be as likely to crash your computer as it would be to give you a delightful 3D avatar chat experience. And I don't want to say that we weren't worried about this, right? We had lots of reasons to be afraid to do this. First of all, we were really worried that, like, some journalist, there's an open beta, so someone New York Times could go try our product and they could write an article. Idiots from startup number 1 don't know what quality means, put out bad product, story at 5, right? That was a possibility. We could be really embarrassed. Of course, we were worried that we could be ruining our brand equity because customers would come, try our product, use it, see that it was bad, and then come to a bad conclusion about our future products. As the kind of VP engineering CTO, I was particularly nervous because I had plenty of mentors who told me, listen, dude, you're going to ruin your professional reputation. People are going to think you don't know the difference between high quality and low quality software, and that's going to be a problem. And that was very worrying to me. But we were worried about something else more. We were worried that we would build yet another product that just nobody wanted. And so we were determined to test that assumption as quickly as possible. And as it turns out, our fears were misplaced. We really didn't need to be worried because, of course, nobody used the product. Right? We just shipped this thing after 180 days. We put it out on the web. And those of you who have ever shipped downloadable software on the web know, people don't just show up in droves on day 1 and start downloading your product. In fact, it's actually quite hard to get consumers to come to a new site and try downloading something. That requires a certain set of skills. And so very few customers, I would say very close to zero, ever found out that we had a bad product of low quality. So ask yourself, all those features we packed into our low-quality 3D client, all that stressing and worrying about the level of quality it would have, and crash reporting, and 3D rendering, and was any of that actually worthwhile? Did any of that constitute progress? Because we didn't even master the basics of how to create a landing page. So maybe we should have started with that first. That's not the only thing that we did that was considered a little bit strange. We charged money for that product. So InView from its first incarnation has always been a freemium paid product. And this was considered an especially bad idea, not just for the normal reasons why you shouldn't charge for a bad product. I mean, talk about really pissing your brand equity away. But I think I mentioned that InView is a communication product. It's in the instant messaging space. So that means it's a network effects business. Everyone knows network effects, right? Metcalfe's law, that the value of a communication network increases with the square of the number of participants, which is a fancy jargon way of saying you have to reach critical mass before your product can be successful. And anything you do that impedes critical mass is a huge mistake, like charging for your product. And so we were worried about the critical mass issue, but of course we were worried about another issue even more. We were worried that the core assumption under which our whole company was going to be built was as follows: that real people would spend real money to buy virtual clothes for their virtual avatar. And when I used to talk to people about this like 2 or 3 years ago, like it was actually a good laugh line. I would get all kinds of chuckles. Now it seems like everyone considers it obvious. Like, of course, God, consumers will pay all kinds of money for God knows what virtual crap. But in 2004, we were on, how should I say, we were out on a limb. We were being routinely laughed out of investors' offices because it was considered ludicrous that Americans, anyway, would engage in this behavior. Sure, people knew that kind of in Korea some weird stuff was going on, but you know, that's over there, so we don't need to worry about it or something. So we were determined that we would test what we thought was our most risky assumption first. And it had an interesting side effect. I said that almost nobody would use our crappy product, but that's not strictly true. There were some people who would use and would pay for our product. And you gotta say, who are those crazy people? Right? Who on earth would pay for a 3D avatar chat product that A, nobody else uses, so you can't chat with anybody, and B, doesn't work because it's low quality and it crashes your computer? Right? That's the definition of a visionary customer. A true early adopter is someone who's not buying the product as it exists today, but is buying into the vision of the product as it will be one day, and they want to have been there first. And entrepreneurs don't always like to hear this, but actually visionary customers are as visionary, or I actually think more visionary and frankly smarter than the founders of the companies that serve them. Because like, you're new to this problem, right? You just had this great idea and you're creating a company around it. They live the problem every day. And so those of them that are actually pretty smart and pretty creative, they're the ones who truly understand at a deep level the problem that you're trying to solve. And so we had an interesting side effect. InView has been in continuous dialogue with those people for its whole life. And if you talk to those people, if we had one of them in the room, I'm guessing just looking demographically that we don't, if you did, I think they would say something like the following. Sure, the InView guys were helpful in building this product. Like, they were a necessary part of having it be created. You know, they're kind of like the hired help, but I really built the product. If it wasn't for me, this product would never have existed, and they wouldn't have known. And these guys can list 10 different critical features that they were the ones who had the insight for. Never mind that they're one of 1,000 people who all had the same insight. The level of ownership that they feel over the product is incredible. And as the product grows, they became the seeds of a really passionate community that eventually helped us reach a much broader non-early adopter segment, and we eventually made it not crash, too. We did something else. We ship code multiple times a day. InView doesn't talk a lot about its internal metrics and process publicly, but in 2008 they talked about shipping code on average about 50 times a day. And I want to be super clear what this means, especially for the engineers in the room. This means that when you check in code at InView to the trunk, there are no branches, approximately 20 minutes later that code is running live in production. And I like to look around the room and see who's an engineer. I can tell because of this horrified look on their face. Because you can see them, the wheels are turning and enumerating all the things that could go wrong. For those of you not engineers, let me say exactly what they're thinking. First of all, hold on, any random engineer could randomly take the site down. Right? That doesn't seem like a very good idea. Or they could reintroduce an old bug, right? Introduce a regression. That doesn't sound very good. There's my personal favorite, which is they could remove the checkout button from your e-commerce flow, and now your business has become a hobby. That doesn't seem like a very good idea. And all those concerns are real. Those things do happen, and listen, they have happened. But we practice a methodology called continuous deployment that turns those problems into solvable problems. So at InView, these things can happen, but as a matter of fact, they don't. The system, we practice something I call the cluster immune system that makes it quite hard for an employee at InView to take the site down, to reintroduce an old bug, to harm our business in any way. And in fact, as a result, we've had some really interesting benefits, one of which is that we can spin new engineers up in one day. So when a new engineer starts at InView, they ship code to production on their first day. I'll admit, sometimes it's been the second day, but if it's the third day, we would consider that a major, serious problem. And the second thing is, there's this huge class of features that you discover with continuous deployment. They're features that take longer to prioritize than they do to build. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Arguing about them and deciding to do them is actually more time-consuming than building them themselves. So we don't have that problem at InView. When we want to run an experiment that's going to affect some subset of customers, we can do that without having to agonize over it. And then we can look at the results of that experiment when making our prioritization decisions. So you got to imagine years of this company operating in an environment where prioritization happens with facts, not opinions. It's actually pretty cool. And no PR, no launch. We didn't want to repeat the stealth mistake, but we also didn't want to get distracted. So we were really focused on making sure that our attention was focused on what our customers wanted, not what journalists wanted, not what our investors wanted, not what kind of random people in Silicon Valley, which we got to admit, it's a bit of an echo chamber. We didn't want to pay attention to that. We really wanted to focus only on our customers. And I'm not allowed to say very much about what happened. I can say that InView's doing very well. It is a profitable company. It has 2007 revenues of about $10 million and more since then, but I'm prohibited from saying more than that. So about a year ago, I left InView and decided that I wanted to focus my energy on answering this question that I started with at the beginning, which is, why do startups fail? And what's going on? And so I started writing the blog, Startup Lessons Learned. Any readers in the audience of the blog? Wow, well, thank you all very much. I appreciate it. And I started working as an advisor to some relatively well-known venture capital firms and working as a consultant with founders and as advisor and kind of doing a lot in the startup ecosystem to try and answer this question and make sense of some of these conundrums, not the least of which was, how come in startup number one, when we did everything right, according to all the people and like normal people you ask for advice in Silicon Valley, we got such a terrible outcome. And then in startup number two, when we did things that people thought were laughably stupid, we got such a better outcome. And so in the course of that investigation, I have come up with this methodology. I call it the Lean Startup. And I want to just walk you through an overview of what it's about. The fundamental idea is that Lean Startups go faster. Right? I talked about the speed with which you can do those pivots, those major iterations that help you find product market fit. Because speed doesn't matter if you're going in a circle. Right? Then you're just going out of business faster. That's not helpful. We need to make sure that we're actually plotting a course with respect to a true vision, not a delusion. And that's what everything else I'm going to talk about today is really about. Three major trends. I'll just put these up here. First is the commodity technology stack, or the idea of leverage in product development. I assume this is an audience for whom this concept is relatively well understood, so I won't belabor the point. Second is a methodology called customer development, which is a rigorous way of finding out what customers want before it's too late, aka before you've already built it. And of course, agile product development, but not your daddy's agile. This is agile, but tuned to that soil of extreme uncertainty I mentioned at the top, specifically for startups. Commodity technology stack. I feel like this point has been beaten to death, so I really don't want to retread old material, but I do think one thing is important. It's pretty obvious that the new technology stacks are driving down costs. So, right, we have weekend apps and the ability to create basically any web-based product, for $10,000 or less. That's if you're being really, fancy about it. And so we can create startups for a lot less money, and that's interesting. But I think the more interesting point is its impact on speed. The amount of time it takes to try something new in all high-tech product categories is falling through the floor. So although I was really proud that we built our first product prototype in 6 months in 2004, if today someone was pitching that product and they were going to waste 6 months before showing that product to customers, I would think that was laughable. I mean, truly ridiculous, because it's gotten that much easier just in the last 5 years to build new products. And although the apps that are coming out of weekend apps today are not very interesting, you got to think 5 years from now, they're going to be more capable than probably half the web applications that were built this year. Customer development, I want to take a moment to plug a book. This is the book, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany by Steve Blank, who's a personal mentor and also an investor in InView. The idea here is to have a corresponding discipline with product development. So we tend to be really rigorous about how we run product development and then kind of be like, well, whatever the marketing and suits do, that's up to them. But that's actually not a very good formula for success. Instead, let's have a rigorous approach to really answering the question, when we're done building this thing, is anybody going to want it? Best way to answer that question, first step, is buy this book. So please buy the book. And then agile product development. I mentioned there were some disclaimers in here. I'm just going to put these up and move on. Suffice to say that although my background is in software, the principles that we're talking about really have nothing to do with software specifically. Plus, name me a product in the industrialized world that isn't built with software. So it's kind of a moot point, I assume. Again, in this room, we understand that. So let me revisit the tale of two startups. But let me now do it schematically, not just about my idiosyncratic experience, but kind of viewing it in the context of what's happening to the whole industry. And it's traditional in a talk about any development methodology. Always you have to start by beating up on the waterfall methodology. It's an absolute tradition amongst consultants and talking heads of all kinds. I'm not exempt from this law. So behold, the waterfall development methodology. And actually, although it's really fun to beat up on waterfall, it's actually important to understand that there is a context in which this makes sense. It actually makes good sense to use the waterfall methodology in situations where both the problem and the solution are relatively well understood. Those are situations where you can accurately model what will happen in the future, and what you're building today is relatively similar to what you were building in the past. So everyone knows waterfall. When I was coming up through product development organizations, this is how I was trained. They called it the manufacturing metaphor for product development. The idea is first you figure out what your requirements are, then you deliver some kind of specification which gets designed, the engineers implement it, it's handed off for verification, it becomes maintenance, and the unit of progress is advancing to the next stage. So when QA verifies that some release is ready to go to customers, you celebrate. Whether or not the release actually ever does go to customers is kind of irrelevant. And you can see how this leads pretty much directly to achieving failure, because you're getting the constant positive reinforcement of progress, even if what you're building has no end users for it whatsoever. So, like I said, fun to beat up on waterfall, but actually important to understand the context that it's good for. But unfortunately, none of us live in that world. And forget startups for a second. If you look at the academic research for like any software projects at all that are built with waterfall, something like 60% of them fail outright. And just ponder that for a second. That means the lucky projects, the so-called successful projects, are the ones that come in way late and way over budget. That's a win. That's the 4 out of 10. 6 out of 10 literally never complete. They just spiral out of control. Because software is intangible. It's actually very hard to manage. And so people are familiar with Agile. How many people actually practice an Agile programming or Agile development methodology today? Wow, that's lower than I thought. So maybe you'll relate to this concept then. Agile is a methodology that came out of enterprise software. It was built for big companies. The idea here is that we have a situation where the problem is known but the solution is unknown. So let's build the solution iteratively so that we get periodic progress reports, not in the form of like documentation that we spent time, but instead in working software that we can see it's not complete, but at least it's functional. So the unit of progress here is a line of working code, which is actually a very important, and I think fairly radical insight, because it means that any activity that we do in our company that doesn't directly or indirectly lead to a line of working code is waste. So we write documentation that nobody reads, or we create a specification that goes stale. We have basically any kind of meeting, or spend time with our pointy-haired boss. Those are all forms of waste that Agile lets us eliminate. But you got to think about the kinds of projects that Agile is good for. The canonical, like extreme programming. This is the extreme programming methodology here. It's my personal favorite Agile methodology. A canonical project is something like this. A big company needs a new payroll system. And the old payroll system has been running for 25 years, and it runs on mainframes that use a programming language that no one even knows the name of anymore, let alone knows how to modify. And it needs to be ported to some new, contemporary architecture. And remember, that's one of those IT projects that under waterfall fails 6 out of 10 times. So by building it iteratively, we can improve the performance of that kind of project. And we do things that collapse the feedback loop between the implementers and the designers or specifiers of the product. So just to pick one example, in XP, we would actually sit an in-house customer next to the engineers who are building the product while they're building the product. So if they have a question like, what the hell is payroll and how does it work? Or maybe what button should be on the screen, or what language should we use here? They can literally turn their chair to someone next to them and say, excuse me, can you answer this question? And they can get an authoritative answer about how the product should be. That's extremely useful, but what if you're in a situation where you don't even know who to sit with the engineers? That's the world that we live in as entrepreneurs, the unknown problem and the unknown solution. Right? We love to sit a customer next to the engineers, and we don't know who the customer is. In fact, we don't even know what to call the product. We couldn't even put out the ad for, please, potential customer, come here, because we wouldn't know what to say. When we have that level of extreme uncertainty, I think everything changes. And let me give you a concrete example. At InView, like I said, we started life as an instant messaging add-on product. So the idea here was, I mentioned the network effects, right? That we were going to have this problem that in instant messaging there's network effects, which means all the incumbent instant messaging networks already have those effects. Which means that for a new person to switch IM networks, they have to bring all their friends with them. So there's a high switching cost. And so if there's a high switching cost, that means there's a high barrier to entry. It makes it very hard to enter the IM market with a new product. And so our kind of genius strategic insight was that we would build an interoperable IM client that actually worked with every other IM client on the market. And I do mean every other IM client. And we actually interoperated at not the protocol level, but the UI level. So we had a seamless integration so you could just swap back and forth between 3D and 2D instant messaging. And when I do this talk, like in a business school context, I really get the nods now, and they're like, that guy actually sounds pretty smart. I don't know what the hell he's talking about tonight, but I get that. I can diagram that thing on the whiteboard, and that's going to work. And it's a really cool strategy. It sounds good. The only problem with it is everything I just say is incorrect. So all of those statements I just made about instant messaging, network effects, barriers to entry, switching costs, and all wrong. Now, I don't want to get into right now, we can do it in the Q&A if people are curious, why that strategy actually makes no sense. What I want you to do instead is sympathize with me. Okay, I actually wrote the software to do the IM interoperability. I talked about those 180 days. What do you think I spent the 180 days doing? I was working my behind off, building code to do IM interoperability, and I was a real agile devotee. So I really believed that if the code was well factored and had just the right level of documentation, and we had unit test coverage, and we practiced continuous integration, etc., we would drive all the waste out of our product development process. And I wish I could say, and then when it turned out that all the software was waste, I was like, oh, well, let's just throw it away. Of course not. My co-founders had to drag me, kicking me, screaming, to admit that, okay, the last 180 days, I just built tens of thousands of lines of code that, in fact, like the company would have been just as well off if I'd been on the beach having a good time instead, because it was actually utterly worthless, even though it was well factored, and if I do say so myself, had beautiful test coverage and blah, blah, blah. That was a revelation to me. It was inconceivable that if we practiced good practices, we could still wind up with waste. But of course, the biggest source of waste in any startup is building something that nobody wants, which is a recurring theme of all of my experience we've talked about so far. When we're talking about pivoting, we're pivoting because we just built something that nobody wants. That's the enduring, I would say, the curse of startup product development, is you're constantly building products, doing a good job, and having it still fail. And so the alternative is to move away from the unit of progress, which is a line of working code, because that's not good enough. Instead, I propose the following unit of progress. I said before, when a founder goes to sleep, they're not sure if they made progress that day because they don't know how to measure progress. Well, now you will. The unit of progress is what I call validated learning, which is a little bit odd. It means that what matters in an early stage company is what we learned, what happened between the ears of all the employees of the company, and emphatically not any other artifact. The code doesn't matter, the revenue doesn't matter, no metric matters, the investment dollars don't matter. None of that constitutes progress if it's not accompanied by learning. And not just any learning, because like I said, you can sit at the whiteboard like I did and learn all kinds of strategic insights. We need validated learning. That's where the code and traction and revenue, I put dollars here because revenue is my favorite form of validation. The proof that you're following a vision and not a delusion. That's what we're looking for. And so the lean startup is a methodology for systematically attacking that unit of progress. Here I've diagrammed it as a problem team and a solution team. So one of the myths of entrepreneurship it's time to let go is the myth of departments. That's one of those things where we know big companies have departments, and a startup is a small company, therefore a startup should have departments. Anyone who did logic in college will say, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound right, it's bogus. Instead of having an engineering department, a QA department, and a marketing department, what I propose for startups is to have two cross-functional teams. The problem team, executing the discipline of customer development, asking themselves this simple question: what problem are we trying to solve? And is there any evidence whatsoever that it's a problem worth solving? In parallel with the solution team, who's doing what we used to call engineering ops and QA, that is, building a product according to the current hypothesis of what we think is going to work. So we're not just engaged in a whiteboard exercise, because then again, that's going to lead to going around in circles. We're still building a product according to the current vision. But like I said, we have people in the building whose job is to step out of the reality distortion field and check vision or delusion, vision or delusion. And then I tried to draw this as a company-wide feedback loop where both teams are sharing with each other what they're learning, so that as a whole company, we're achieving that validated learning. Here's the simplified version. This is what I call the fundamental feedback loop of all startups, and I've drawn it again for a software startup because that's my background, but I trust any of you in a different industry can adjust appropriately. A software company is basically a catalyst for turning ideas into code. Everything else is a side effect. Might be a necessary side effect, but a side effect nonetheless. And after we build that code, if we're feeling a little bit intelligent, maybe we'll show that code to some customers and generate some data about what's happening. I don't just mean quantitative data, I mean any information about what customers think of our product. And then if we're a really advanced company, not like startup number 1, but more like startup number 2, then we'll try to use that data to learn for the next set of ideas. Okay, that's obvious so far. But here's the heuristic that I think every startup practice or process should be judged against, which is, does it minimize the total time through this feedback loop? This is based on an idea from maneuver warfare called the OODA loop by a guy named John Boyd, if anyone's familiar. There's actually a great biography of John Boyd, which I highly recommend. It's on my blog if people are interested. In war, this is a concept that leads to decisive victories in battle, about which I basically know nothing except what I've read in books. But in startups, this is the mechanism by which we can achieve validated learning better, faster, cheaper. And this diagram is helpful for understanding why most of the so-called best practices, when they get transplanted into startups, are utterly fatal. Most best practices optimize for one leg of this feedback loop at the expense of another, which is not an optimization at all. So for example, you ever heard an engineer complain about the data warehousing code? See, it takes so much extra time to build the product because it has all this stupid monitoring and metrics in it. We have to waste time supporting these highly scalable reports that probably nobody reads. The argument is as follows. I could code faster if we stopped measuring things. And the problem with that argument is that it is true. You in fact can